The night of June 17, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler had 6 torpedo tubes loaded in the bow of the submarine USS Cavalla, hull number SS-244. Above him, in the dark, the Imperial Japanese Navy was going past. Not a convoy, not a straggler, 15 or more heavy warships in formation running east at 19 knots, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. Kossler had a firing position on one of those carriers. He had loaded tubes. He had a crew on their first war patrol who had crossed an ocean waiting for exactly this. He took his boat down and let them pass over the top of him, and he counted. 15 ships. Course, speed, the shape of the zigzag, every one of them inside the range of weapons he did not use. There is a version of the Battle of the Philippine Sea that starts with the airplanes. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, 450 American Hellcats, the largest carrier battle ever fought, and a nickname for it that American pilots would coin before the week was out. That version leaves something out. Before any of it happened, in the 5 weeks leading up to it, American submarine skippers found the Japanese fleet over and over again, and again, for reasons that were not the same each time. They did not sink it. This is what that cost. And what it bought. In June of 1944, there were roughly 40 American submarines operating in the Pacific. Most of them answered to one man, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, at Pearl Harbor. For the invasion of the Marianas, Lockwood wore a second hat. He commanded Task Force 17, and he committed 19 boats to the operation, 19 submarines. And the first thing worth saying about them is where they were not. Every American submarine was deliberately kept clear of the waters around Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Not because there was nothing there, because there was too much there. Hundreds of American ships were about to converge on those islands, and the fastest way to lose a submarine was to have an American destroyer find one in the middle of an amphibious assault. So the rule was simple, and it was absolute. American submarines stay outside the box. Anything that surfaces inside the box is Japanese, and it gets sunk. That single decision says a great deal about the war these men were fighting. Somebody in an office in Hawaii drew a line on a chart, and 40 crews lived inside that line whether they liked it or not. The commander of Japan's submarine force had issued his men the same order, for the same reason. Neither side's submarines went into the water off Saipan that June. 2 enemies working from opposite ends of the ocean arrived at exactly the same rule. The rest of the boats were placed by a different kind of arithmetic. As early as the 30th of April, American code-breaking had begun picking up Japanese signal traffic about preparing a major anchorage in the southern Philippines. On the 11th of May, Captain Arthur McCollum, intelligence officer to Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, briefed his admiral that the Imperial Japanese Navy intended to concentrate at Tawi-Tawi by the 15th. The fleet arrived on schedule. 4 American submarines were already being moved to meet it, with 5 more spread through the Philippines behind them. Every one of those boats was in position because somebody in a windowless room had read Japanese radio traffic and made a call about where the enemy was going to be. Then there was the question of what they were told to shoot at. Beginning in April of 1944, the American submarine force changed its target priorities. Destroyers moved up the list, above tankers, above cargo ships, above everything except capital warships. That was not a small change. For 2 years, the submarine campaign had been an economic war. Sink the freighters, starve the islands, cut the oil. Now Pearl Harbor was telling its skippers something different. Kill the escorts. Take away the enemy's ability to protect anything. Which means that by the summer of 1944, a submarine captain looking through a periscope was not simply asking whether he could hit something, he was asking whether he was allowed to. And on the other side of that periscope, the Japanese fleet had a problem it could not drill its way out of. 9 Japanese aircraft carriers had been ordered to gather at an anchorage called Tawi-Tawi off the northeast coast of Borneo. They were not there because it was a good harbor. They were there because it was close to the Tarakan oil fields, and by 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was so short of fuel that it had begun pumping unrefined crude oil straight out of the ground and into the bunkers of its warships. A fleet that has to park next to the well is a fleet that has already lost something. Over the next 5 weeks, that anchorage would be the most closely watched piece of water on Earth. May 14th, 1944. The submarine USS Bonefish, SS-223, worked her way into the approaches off Tawi-Tawi and badly damaged a Japanese tanker. Then she put torpedoes into the destroyer Inazuma and sank her. 161 men went down with the ship, including her captain. May 22nd. The light carrier Chitose came out of the anchorage to conduct flight training, the kind of training the Japanese carrier air groups needed more than anything else they were short of. The submarine USS Puffer, SS-268, was waiting. Puffer fired. The torpedoes ran, and they exploded in Chitose's wake. No hits, no damage. By every measure a submarine skipper uses to judge himself, it was a failure. Then the Japanese stopped flying. After that morning, open ocean flight training in the Tawi-Tawi area essentially ended. 4 weeks later, the pilots who would fly against Task Force 58 flew with the hours they had, and not 1 hour more. June 6th. Commander Samuel D. Dealey brought the submarine USS Harder, SS-257, into the Sibutu Passage on the 5th war patrol of a boat that already had a reputation. Dealey had asked for this patrol area specifically. He wanted the destroyers. He found a convoy of 3 tankers with 2 destroyers escorting. He was setting up on the surface when the moonlight caught his boat and put her in silhouette. The destroyer Minazuki turned and came straight at him. A submarine on the surface with a destroyer bow on has seconds, not minutes. Dealey did not dive. He swung Harder's stern around, put the oncoming destroyer square in line with his aftertubes, and fired 3 torpedoes straight down the throat of the ship that was coming to kill him. 2 of them hit. Minazuki went down in 5 minutes, her own depth charges detonating as she sank. 45 of her crew were pulled from the water. June 7th. Dealey did it again. The destroyer Hayanami took another down-the-throat shot and blew apart. 208 men were lost, including the ship's captain and the commander of Destroyer Division 32. June 9th. The destroyer Tanikaze, 2 torpedoes, a massive boiler explosion, and 114 dead. 3 destroyers in 4 days, every one of them taken head-on, at ranges where a miss meant Harder was finished. Samuel Dealey was awarded the Medal of Honor for that patrol. There is one more thing in the record, and it belongs in this story because the United States Navy's own historians put it there. Dealey reported that on June 9th, he hit and sank a 4th destroyer. Japanese records do not confirm it. There is no wreck, no name, no crew list. Whatever Harder hit that day, if she hit anything, has never been identified. 80 years later, that one is still open. So here is what 5 weeks of American submarine work had produced off Tawi-Tawi by the 2nd week of June. 4 Japanese warships on the bottom, 3 of them destroyers. A carrier force that had been driven out of the practice areas it needed, and a fleet that still had not sailed. The submarines were not trying to sink the Japanese Navy at its moorings. They were making it impossible for the Japanese Navy to get ready. June 13th, 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet weighed anchor and stood out of Tawi-Tawi. The submarine USS Redfin, SS-272, was watching. Redfin tried twice to get into an attack position as the Japanese ships came out. Twice she failed. No hits, No damage, nothing to enter in the column that submariners cared about. What Redfin did instead was surface and transmit. Her contact report was one of the most important American signals of the entire battle. It told Admiral Raymond Spruance that Ozawa had sortied, and on what date, the first hard confirmation that the Japanese carrier fleet had left its anchorage and was moving. On that same day, aboard the Japanese carrier Taihō, the newest and largest carrier in the Imperial Navy, in commission for barely 3 months, a pilot with inadequate training crashed on landing and destroyed 6 aircraft. June 15th, 1622 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Commander Robert D. Risser had the submarine USS Flying Fish, SS-229, patrolling near San Bernardino Strait, the passage through the middle of the Philippines, and through his periscope came the first mobile fleet, in column, exiting the strait into open water. Risser could not attack. Flying Fish was low on fuel, low enough that a high-speed approach would have left her unable to get home. He held his position, watched the most valuable target of his career go by, and waited for the sun to go down. At sunset, he surfaced and reported. At close to the same hour, a couple of 100 miles to the south, Lieutenant Commander Slade D. Cutter in the submarine USS Seahorse, SS-304, sighted a separate Japanese force coming north out of the New Guinea area. Heavy units, big ones. Seahorse had a mechanical failure. Cutter could not pursue. What he had found, and could not touch, was the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built, running north to join Ozawa. 3 American submarines, 3 separate sightings of the Japanese fleet in 72 hours, 0 torpedo hits. Count what those 3 failures produced. Redfin established that the carriers had sailed, and when. Flying Fish established which passage they used and when they cleared it. Seahorse established that a second Japanese force, built around heavy units, was coming north to join them. Departure, route, reinforcement. Spruance responded to those 3 signals the way a man responds to information he believes. He asked General MacArthur to extend the search range of his B-24 Liberators to maximum, and got it. He ordered 6 Martin Mariner flying boats forward from Eniwetok to work out of Saipan, which pushed American search coverage out to 600 miles. None of that happens on a hunch. It happens because 3 submarine skippers who all missed had all reported. The first 2 of those 3 did not fire because they could not. The third one, 2 days later, would not fire because he decided not to. While all of that was going on, 1 American submarine was in the Marianas, doing something else entirely. The submarine USS Stingray, SS-186, was an old boat by 1944, commissioned in 1938, 6 years before, with a crew of about 60 men. For her 11th war patrol, she was assigned lifeguard station off Guam. Her job was not to sink anything. Her job was to sit off an enemy-held island and wait for American pilots to fall out of the sky. On June 11th, she pulled a downed Navy aviator out of the water. The next day, she pulled out 2 more. On June 13th, she received word that another Navy airman was down, roughly 500 yards off the beach. 500 yards is inside the range of everything. Japanese guns ashore opened up, and shells came down on either side of the submarine. So her captain tried something that existed in a briefing document and had never once been performed. The procedure was called a periscope rescue. The submarine approaches the man in the water submerged, with nothing showing above the surface but the periscope. The pilot swims to it. He grabs it. And he holds on while the boat tows him clear, still underwater, still hidden, with 1 American on the outside of the hull and the rest of them blind inside it. Every part of that is a problem. The water off Guam is shallow, and a submarine maneuvering submerged that close inshore has very little room underneath her. A periscope cutting a wake still leaves a feather on the surface, which is still something for a gun crew ashore to aim at. And a man in a life vest who has just been shot down has to understand what is happening well enough to swim toward a steel tube instead of away from it. Stingray made 4 submerged approaches with shells falling around her. On the 4th one, the pilot got his hands on the periscope. Then he held on, through open water, under fire, dragged out to sea by a ship he could not see, until Stingray was clear of the island and could bring him aboard. Same weapon, same month, same ocean. A week earlier, a submarine off Borneo had put 3 torpedoes into a destroyer at point-blank range and killed it in 5 minutes. Off Guam, it was a handrail. If that pilot and the men who went in after him are worth an extra minute of somebody's attention, drop a like on this video so the story gets further than it has. The submarine USS Cavalla, SS-244, was commissioned on the 29th of February 1944, a date that only exists once every 4 years. She cleared Pearl Harbor on the 31st of May. This was her first war patrol, and the first command of Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kossler. Her orders sent her toward station in the eastern Philippines. She never got there. June 16th. Cavalla found a group of ships that were not warships. They were oilers, Ozawa's second supply force, the tanker group that was going to refuel the first mobile fleet, somewhere out in the Philippine Sea. Kossler went after them, and the escorts drove him off. When he came back up, the tankers were gone. He had spent a day on it and had nothing, and his assigned station was still hundreds of miles away. He radioed Pearl Harbor that he intended to break off and resume his patrol. Lockwood told him to stay on the tankers. The reasoning behind that order is the hinge of this whole story, and it is worth being exact about. Lockwood did not want the oilers because oilers were valuable. He wanted them because a tanker group in the middle of the Philippine Sea is not going anywhere by itself. It is going to a rendezvous. Follow the fuel, and the fuel leads to the carriers. Cavalla turned around and went back down the tanker's estimated track. The evening of June 17th, she made contact again. It was not the tanker group. 15 or more heavy ships in formation, zigzagging on a mean course to the east at 19 knots. Kossler had found Ozawa's main body. He worked in toward the formation and found himself in a favorable position for an approach on one of the carriers. 6 tubes forward, a target that had not seen him. The kind of setup that submarine captains spend entire careers not getting. And the requirement he was operating under put the contact report ahead of everything else. So Herman Kossler took Cavalla down and let the Imperial Japanese Navy go by overhead. He tracked them from underneath, through the sound gear, through the periscope, and counted. 15 or more large combatants. Then course, then speed. He waited until the formation was gone. He surfaced. He transmitted. The thing I cannot get past about that night is that Kossler had no way of knowing whether he had just done the right thing, and no way of finding out. He had no idea where the American carriers were. Nobody had told him. He had no idea whether his report had been received or believed or acted on. He had passed up the best shot of his life on the strength of a rule. Then he went back to work, and he was still working when the answer arrived, somewhere he would never see it. 4 o'clock in the morning, June 18th, aboard the carrier USS Lexington, CV-16, flagship of Task Force 58. Captain Arleigh Burke, Chief of Staff to Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, brought his commander the Cavalla sighting. Burke had worked the numbers off it, and the number he carried to Mitcher was this. At dawn, the Japanese fleet would be 660 miles west of Saipan, not somewhere out there. 660 miles, on a bearing, at a time. That is a different category of thing from a sighting. A sighting tells a commander the enemy exists. A course and a speed, taken from a submarine that stayed under the formation long enough to watch it zigzag, lets a staff officer run the problem forward and say where the enemy will be tomorrow morning. Burke had done exactly that. At 4 in the morning, on paper, off the word of a lieutenant commander he had never met. Set that next to what the American command already had in hand. The Pacific Fleet intelligence estimate handed to Admiral Spruance said he would be facing 9 Japanese aircraft carriers with 450 aircraft embarked. The actual number of aircraft aboard Ozawa's carriers was 440. The estimate was off by 10 airplanes. Now set that against the picture on the other side of the ocean. Ozawa's battle plan depended on land-based Japanese aircraft flying out of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, several hundred of them, striking the American fleet from the east while his carriers struck from the west. By the time the Marines went ashore on Saipan on June 15th, something in the order of 200 of those aircraft had already been destroyed, in the air and on the ground, by American carrier strikes flown in the days before the landings. The Japanese officer responsible for those aircraft did not report the true scale of the losses. 2 fleets were about to meet. One of them knew how many aircraft the other had and was wrong by 10. The other one did not know how many aircraft it had itself. June 19th, 8 o'clock in the morning. The submarine USS Albacore, SS-218, was on her 9th war patrol. It was Commander James W. Blanchard's first patrol as her captain. The day before, Albacore had been shifted 100 miles south of her assigned area on the strength of intelligence. That is worth stating plainly. She was not where she was by luck. Somebody had read the traffic, drawn a conclusion, and moved a submarine to meet it. At about 0800, Blanchard came up to periscope depth. He was inside Ozawa's main carrier group, not near it. Inside it, past a destroyer screen of 6 ships in the middle of the most valuable collection of warships remaining to the Imperial Japanese Navy, with 3 fleet carriers in his field of view. Blanchard let the first carrier go by. He wanted a better angle on the second one, and he took the time to get it. On the 9th patrol of a boat that had spent 2 years hunting, with the biggest target of the Pacific War in front of him, he passed on the first shot and waited for a cleaner one. The second carrier was Taihō, and she was launching her contribution to Ozawa's main strike of the day. 16 fighters, 17 dive bombers, and 9 torpedo planes, forming up overhead. And at the moment Blanchard needed it, the torpedo data computer failed. The TDC was the piece of equipment that made a submarine attack work. It solved the geometry: target course, target speed, own course, torpedo run, gyro angle, faster and better than a man could. When it worked, a skipper fired a solution. When it did not, he fired a guess. Blanchard put his eye to the periscope and did the arithmetic himself. He fired all 6 bow tubes. A Japanese pilot, Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, had been airborne for a matter of seconds. He saw the torpedo tracks and flew his aircraft into the path of one of them. He and his gunner were killed, and the torpedo was destroyed. Of the remaining 5, 4 missed. One did not. It struck Taihō on the starboard side, just forward of the No. 1 aircraft elevator. It cracked an aviation fuel tank, flooded the elevator well with a mixture of fuel oil, aviation gasoline, and seawater, and jammed the elevator 6 feet below the level of the flight deck. 3 Japanese destroyers came over the top of Albacore and started dropping. Blanchard took his boat deep and stayed there while they worked him over, and the carrier did not sink. Her crew planked over the jammed elevator. Flight operations resumed in under 30 minutes. Taihō went on making 26 knots and went on launching aircraft, and to anyone watching from outside, she looked like a ship that had absorbed a torpedo and shrugged. When the depth charging finally let up, Blanchard surfaced and made his report. He said he had attacked what he believed was a Shōkaku-class carrier. He said he did not believe he had sunk anything. He was, in the phrase the Navy recorded, angry about missing a golden opportunity. 6 torpedoes had gone into the water that morning. 1 had been stopped by a man in an airplane. 4 had missed. Nobody in the United States Navy would find out what the sixth one did for the better part of 2 months. Around midday on that same 19th of June, Cavalla came up for a look, 10:48 in the morning. Costler raised the periscope and saw a carrier landing aircraft, steaming a steady course into a southeast wind, throwing a heavy bow wave. A destroyer was keeping station off her starboard side. 2 cruisers were ahead, off her port bow. The carrier was Shōkaku, a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a survivor of the Coral Sea, a survivor of Santa Cruz. And Costler was not certain she was Japanese. Nobody had told him where the American carriers were. It was not his need to know. So the man looking at the largest target of his life had to hold open the possibility that he was looking at one of his own ships, and there was exactly one way to settle it. He closed the range until he could see the flag. The entire approach took 3 looks through the periscope. 3, on a boat that had been in commission for less than 4 months. At 11:18, at a range of 1,200 yards, not fathoms and not feet, Cavalla fired all 6 bow tubes at 8-second intervals, 3 Mark 14 torpedoes and 3 Mark 23s. The computer expected 4 hits. Then the destroyer Urakaze saw the wakes and came around hard. Costler had to start down while the 5th torpedo was still leaving the tube. The 6th went out at a down angle and hung for a moment before it ran. 3 of them hit. Urakaze's first depth charge detonated at the same instant as the first torpedo impact on Shōkaku. 1 explosion for the carrier and 1 for the submarine in the same second. What followed is the bill for the 17th of June. 3 Japanese destroyers held Cavalla down for 3 hours. Costler counted the depth charges as they came. He counted 105. In the emergency dive, she went 100 feet below her own test depth. The main air induction trunk flooded and put roughly 15 tons of seawater inside the boat, which made her heavy and hard to hold. 3 of her 4 sound gear sets flooded out, which left her nearly deaf with 3 destroyers hunting her. And because running the pumps would have made noise the Japanese could hear, Costler could not pump the water out. To hold his depth without pumping, he had to increase speed, which made a different kind of noise and gave the destroyers something else to find. That is the choice he was working with, 400 feet down on his first war patrol. Be heard bailing or be heard running. He ran. Above him, Shōkaku was burning. Aviation fuel had come out of ruptured lines in the hangar and caught. The fireproof shutters between hangar bays failed to work. Her crew fought that fire for hours. The same ship had survived Coral Sea and survived Santa Cruz, and this time they lost it. She went down with 1,272 men aboard. About 570 were pulled from the water by a light cruiser and 2 destroyers. Cavalla heard the explosions through the hull. At 18:51 she surfaced. At 21:25, well clear of the area, Costler transmitted his attack report to Pearl Harbor. He reported hitting a Shōkaku-class carrier with 3 torpedoes out of 6. He reported 105 depth charges over 3 hours. He reported 4 heavy explosions in the direction of the target, 2.5 hours after the attack. Then he added 4 words. Believe that baby sank. That was everything he was prepared to say. He had been underneath the ship when it happened. He had heard it come apart, and the strongest claim he would put his name to was that he believed it. On the 19th of June, Ozawa launched 326 aircraft against Task Force 58 in 4 separate raids. American radar found every one of those raids while they were still well out, and American fighter direction officers put Hellcats in front of them. American pilots claimed 299 Japanese aircraft shot down that day. The real figure was closer to 220. Both numbers belong in the record, and the gap between them is not a scandal. It is what happens when several hundred men in single-seat fighters try to count in a sky full of smoke. What matters is that the smaller number was still catastrophic. 22 of the 35 men who led Japanese carrier squadrons that day did not come back. Not two-thirds of the aircraft, two-thirds of the leadership, the flight leaders and squadron commanders, the men who had the experience the rest of the air groups did not have. The United States Navy lost 31 aircraft on the 19th of June. At 15:30 that afternoon, Taihō, the ship Blanchard believed he had failed to sink, was torn open by an internal explosion. What set it off has never been established. At 1700, Ozawa transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro because his remaining carriers were already over the horizon. Haguro did not carry the secure communications equipment a fleet flagship needs. For a stretch of that evening, the commander of the Japanese fleet could not decode the messages his own headquarters was sending him. Taihō went to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. How many men went with her is still argued over. The Navy's own historians put the most defensible figure at 656, while noting that a far higher number, 1,650 out of a crew of 2,100, is the one usually printed. 80 years on, the accounts still do not agree, and there is no honest way to close that gap here. The next evening, June 20th, Task Force 58 caught what was left of the first mobile fleet at the extreme edge of its range, and struck. When that strike was over, Vice Admiral Ozawa had 35 operational aircraft left aboard his carriers. He had gone to sea with 449 flight decks. He came out of the 20th of June with 6 flight decks and 35 airplanes, fewer than one American fleet carrier put in the sky on an ordinary morning. James Blanchard learned that Taihō had sunk about 2 months later from the interrogation of a Japanese prisoner of war. Until then, the American record credited him with damage to a Shōkaku-class carrier. When the confirmation came in, his decoration was upgraded, and he was awarded the Navy Cross for a ship he had spent the summer believing he did not sink. Cavalla was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. Herman Kossler received the Navy Cross. And in the Navy's own account of what earned that citation, the story does not open on the 19th of June with the torpedoes. It opens on the 17th. With a submarine that made contact with a large Japanese task force, tracked it for hours, and relayed the information. The man who saw more of the Japanese fleet than anyone in the United States Navy sent home 4 words. Not one of them was certain. Submarine crews came back from the Pacific and mostly did not talk. They were not permitted to during the war. The boats, and the intelligence behind them, were among the most tightly held secrets the country had, and a great many of them never picked up the habit afterward. Sons and grandsons found out decades later, or at a funeral, or never. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific or in Korea, and there is a piece of his story that never made it out of the house, put it in the comments. Somebody's family is looking for that name. 50 American dive bombers came down on the Japanese carrier fleet at 22 minutes past 10 in the morning. 3 of the 4 carriers below them were finished. Japan never rebuilt the force that died there, and the men it could not replace were not the pilots. For 60 years, what Americans pictured on those flight decks came from one Japanese officer's memoir. Japan's own war records say it did not happen that way. He described decks packed with aircraft, engines running, bombs and torpedoes hanging, a strike moments from launching when the American bombs arrived. It has been painted, filmed, and reprinted so many times that it has become the picture almost everyone carries. When the Imperial Navy's official war history was finally published, it showed something else entirely, and it took decades for that to cross the Pacific. This is the 4th of June, 1942, reconstructed from the Japanese operational records, what the Americans did, in what order, and what the men on those flight decks were actually doing when the bombs came through. Those records sat untranslated while the legend hardened. If you want history built out of the documents, rather than out of the legend, hit like. 1 like, nothing more, and we carry on. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had won everything it set out to win, and had solved nothing. The perimeter it now held ran from the Aleutians to the Solomons, and from the Marshalls to the Bay of Bengal. On a map it looked like an empire. In practice it was a fence with no one standing along most of it. Japan did not have the ships, the aircraft, or the fuel to garrison that much ocean, and every mile of it was open to an enemy who could choose where and when to arrive. The Doolittle raid in April had made that point in public, and it settled an argument that had been running inside the Naval General Staff for months. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's answer was not to hold the fence. It was to destroy the thing that could come through it. He did not particularly want Midway Atoll, which was 2 square miles of sand and coral with an airstrip on it and no fresh water to speak of. He wanted the American aircraft carriers, and he believed that if he threatened Midway, the carriers would have to come out and fight for it. The reasoning was sound as far as it went. The execution required Yamamoto to sail most of the Imperial Japanese Navy several thousand miles from its bases, to the far end of its own supply lines, in order to attack a defended position held by a force he believed to be weaker but could not see. It is the oldest error in the book, and it has been made by commanders far less capable than Yamamoto, usually for the same reason. He had won every engagement he had fought so far, and he had begun to assume the enemy would keep behaving the way the enemy had behaved. The assumption was written into the operations order itself. The commander's estimate of the situation, the document that framed how the battle was expected to unfold, stated plainly that the enemy lacked the will to fight. That sentence is the whole battle in miniature. Everything the Japanese did over the following 6 weeks proceeded from it, and it was wrong on the morning it was written. The Americans were not guessing. In a windowless basement in the administration building at Pearl Harbor, a unit of cryptanalysts under Commander Joseph Rochefort had been working on the Imperial Navy's principal operational code since before the war started. They did not read it cleanly. Nobody in that basement ever saw a Japanese message the way you are reading this sentence. What they saw were fragments, recovered code groups, repeated addresses, patterns of traffic volume, and long gaps where the meaning simply did not come. Out of that, they built a picture. Through the spring of 1942, the traffic began to concentrate around an objective the Japanese identified by a 2-letter designator, AF. Rochefort's unit believed AF was Midway. Washington was not convinced, and the disagreement mattered enormously, because if AF was somewhere else, then Admiral Chester Nimitz would be moving his entire remaining carrier strength to the wrong piece of ocean. The way the argument was settled has become the most repeated story in the history of American signals intelligence, and it is repeated because it is genuinely elegant. Midway was instructed, over a cable the Japanese could not read, to broadcast in the clear that its water distillation plant had failed. Shortly afterward, Japanese traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. That is the sort of thing that sounds like invention and was not. It gave Nimitz the location. Further work gave him the approximate date, the composition of the striking force, and the axis along which it would approach. What Nimitz did with that is the part that matters, and it is worth being precise about, because it is where the battle was actually decided. He was not handed a victory. He was handed a piece of information that would be worth nothing at all unless he acted on it faster than the enemy could change the plan it described. Intelligence has an expiry date, and Nimitz had perhaps 3 weeks. He spent them arranging to be in the right place, with more aircraft than the enemy expected him to have. That is not luck. That is a man reading a document correctly and then doing something difficult about it. The Japanese plan was called Operation MI, and its central weakness was visible on the chart before a single ship sailed. Yamamoto did not send one fleet to Midway. He sent 5 separate forces, spread across thousands of miles of the Pacific, each with its own commander, its own objective, and its own timetable. There was the carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo with 4 fleet carriers. There was an invasion convoy carrying the troops meant to occupy the atoll. There was Yamamoto's own main body, built around the largest battleships in the world, positioned hundreds of miles behind the carriers where it could neither see the battle nor influence it. There was a separate operation running simultaneously in the Aleutians, far to the north, involving carriers and cruisers and troops that were not available anywhere else. The dispersal was deliberate. Japanese naval planning had long favored complex schemes involving multiple detachments, converging from multiple directions, on the theory that an enemy confronted with several threats at once would be unable to concentrate against any of them. It looks impressive drawn out on a plotting board. It requires a standard of communication and timing that radio silence, weather, and battle damage make impossible, and it guarantees that at the decisive moment, most of your strength will be 100 miles from the fighting. That is exactly what happened. When the fighting started on the morning of the 4th of June, none of the remainder of that enormous force was in a position to affect the outcome. The battleships never fired. The invasion convoy never landed. The Aleutians force fought its own small separate war 1,000 miles north, and had no bearing on anything. 4 Japanese carriers went into that battle. Everything else Japan brought to the Central Pacific that week was, in operational terms, decoration. Against those 4 carriers, Nimitz put 3, and an island. Tactical command at sea belonged to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher in Task Force 17, flying his flag in the Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had Task Force 16, with the Enterprise and the Hornet having taken it over at short notice when Vice Admiral William Halsey was hospitalized. Spruance had never commanded carriers. He was a cruiser officer, and he inherited Halsey's staff along with Halsey's ships, which turned out to matter. The Yorktown should not have been there at all. She had been badly damaged at the Coral Sea a month earlier, and the estimates for putting her right ran into months. She went into dry dock at Pearl Harbor and came out again in a matter of days, patched rather than repaired, with civilian yard workers still aboard as she sailed. Add Midway's own airstrip to the 2 task forces, and the arithmetic comes out as follows. Nagumo's 4 carriers embarked somewhat under 250 aircraft between them. The Americans had 360 available to throw at him, counting everything based on the atoll. The atoll could not be sunk. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the operative military fact of the entire battle. Nagumo had to neutralize an airfield that would still be there no matter how many bombs he put on it, while operating within range of it, while also finding and destroying a carrier force he did not know was waiting for him. Nimitz had arranged for his enemy to arrive at a specific patch of ocean on a specific morning, outnumbered in aircraft, and obliged to attack a target that could not be removed. He did that with a fragment of code, 3 weeks, and a shipyard working around the clock. The Japanese strike went off before dawn on the 4th of June, 108 aircraft drawn from all 4 carriers tasked with destroying Midway's defenses ahead of the landing. They found the atoll awake. American search aircraft had been flying wide patterns for days, and the incoming raid was picked up early enough that by the time it arrived, every serviceable aircraft on Midway was airborne and gone. There was nothing on the ground to destroy except installations, and installations on a coral atoll are cheap. The strike did its work. It cratered the runway, burned fuel storage, wrecked buildings, and killed men on the ground. Then it turned for home. A little after 5:30 in the morning, a patrol aircraft out of Midway reported 2 Japanese carriers and their escorts, with a bearing, a distance, and a course. The signal reached Fletcher in the Yorktown within minutes. Fletcher had a decision to make about a fleet he still could not see in full. The report gave him 2 carriers. Intelligence had told him to expect 4. Committing his strike against 2 while the other 2 were somewhere unaccounted for was the kind of thing that had cost admirals their fleets in this ocean already. He did it anyway, in stages. He detached Spruance with Task Force 16 and ordered him to attack, while the Yorktown held back to recover her own morning search aircraft and keep something in hand against the 2 carriers still unaccounted for. Dividing a force is generally an error. Here it produced the single most valuable accident of the day, because when the Yorktown finally launched an hour behind Task Force 16, her aircraft reached the target at a different moment and on a different bearing from the Enterprise group. The next decision was Spruance's, and it came out of the staff he had inherited. Standard practice was to close the range before launching, because a strike sent off at extreme distance arrives with less fuel, less time over the target, and a marginal prospect of getting home. Halsey's chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, argued for launching early and long anyway, on the reasoning that Japanese carriers caught in the middle of recovering their midway strike would be worth far more than Japanese carriers caught comfortably. Spruance had commanded carriers for 4 days. He took the advice and sent his aircraft off at a range that put them near the limit of their endurance. The judgment was correct. A number of his pilots paid for it by coming down in the water on the way home. At about the hour Task Force 16 began putting aircraft into the air, the officer leading the Japanese strike back from Midway sent Nagumo a signal that would shape everything after it. A second attack on the atoll was necessary. The assessment was accurate. It was also the beginning of Nagumo's problem, because the aircraft still aboard his carriers were armed for a different mission entirely. Japanese practice held roughly half the air group in reserve against the appearance of enemy warships. Those aircraft were configured for ships, torpedoes on the attack bombers, armor-piercing bombs on the dive bombers. Ordnance suited to sinking a carrier is not ordnance suited to cratering a runway, and converting from one to the other is not a matter of minutes. So Nagumo had to decide whether to strip his reserve and rearm it for the island while holding a defensive posture against an enemy fleet his own reconnaissance had not found. While the American strike was forming up, Nagumo was still looking for the ships it had come from. Why he could not find them is a matter of how the Imperial Japanese Navy searched the sea. The Imperial Navy treated reconnaissance as a secondary function. The strike aircraft were the point of a carrier. Searching was work for cruiser floatplanes and for whatever could be spared. A search pattern flown by a small number of single-engine aircraft, each sweeping outward along a single leg and then returning, covers an area shaped like a fan with enormous empty spaces between the spokes. The further out you go, the wider the gaps become. A fleet sitting in one of those gaps is invisible, and it stays invisible for as long as it stays there. The Americans had built their scouting differently. Carrier scouting squadrons flew search missions as a primary task, in numbers, and the atoll itself launched long-range patrol aircraft that swept hundreds of miles in every direction every day. Midway's search aircraft found the Japanese carriers on the morning of the 4th of June. Nagumo's search aircraft did not find the Americans until the battle was already underway. When the report finally came in, it came from a float plane off the cruiser Tone, and it came in badly. The first message reported ships. It did not say what kind. Nagumo asked for clarification and waited. The follow-up, when it came, mentioned a carrier. So he now knew there was an American carrier within striking distance, somewhere on a bearing he could not fix precisely, belonging to a force he had been assured would not come out. While Nagumo was waiting to hear what his scout had actually found, the attacks began, and for the next 2 hours they did not stop. The Americans threw everything within reach at the Japanese carriers in wave after separate wave, and none of it worked. Midway's own aircraft went first. Marine dive bombers flying obsolete machines, Army heavy bombers releasing from altitude, torpedo bombers going in at wave height without escort. They achieved nothing. Not one bomb, not one torpedo found a Japanese ship. The heavy bombers, dropping from 20,000 feet at ships making 30 knots, were never going to hit anything, and the men who flew the low attacks were shot to pieces by a fighter screen they had no answer to. Then the carrier torpedo squadrons arrived, and what happened to them has been argued about ever since. They came in without fighter escort, in obsolete devastators that were slow enough that Japanese pilots described attacking them as a straightforward matter. The Devastator had been a modern aircraft in 1937. By 1942, it was slower than the fighters defending the target. It carried a torpedo that had to be dropped low, level, and straight to have any chance of running properly, and its crews knew all of this. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet found the Japanese fleet by flying a course its commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had chosen against the one his air group had been given. He was right about where the enemy was. He arrived with 15 aircraft, no escort, and no other American squadron in sight, and he attacked. The squadron was destroyed. One man came out of the water alive. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise pursued the Kaga and lost all but 5 of its 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown attacked the Soryu, and of that squadron only 5 aircraft got close enough to release. Every torpedo missed. Across 3 squadrons and more than 40 aircraft, the Americans put nothing into a Japanese hull. For 2 generations, American accounts explained this with a consoling logic. The torpedo squadrons had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, clearing the sky above for the dive bombers that arrived shortly afterward. Their deaths had bought the victory. The Japanese records do not support that. What pulled the fighter cover out of position was the fighter cover itself. Japanese pilot discipline in the air over the carriers was poor. Individual sections chased targets rather than holding assigned altitudes, and the Kido Butai's system for controlling its own combat air patrol was inadequate to the job of managing a defense at multiple levels simultaneously. The torpedo squadrons did not pull the Zeros down. The Zeros went down because that was how they were being flown. This does not diminish the men who flew those aircraft. It changes what their courage was for. They took off knowing the odds. They flew into a defended fleet without escort, and not one of them turned away. Torpedo Squadron 3 was still fighting for its life when the dive bombers came over the top. The phases of that morning were not sequential. They overlapped, and they were still overlapping when the battle ended. At 17 minutes past 9, Nagumo made the decision that every account of this battle turns on. He is usually described as choosing between an immediate partial strike with whatever was ready and a properly assembled coordinated attack, and faulted for taking the second. The choice, as described, was not available to him, and the reason lies in how his Navy had decided a carrier should fight. Imperial Japanese Navy carrier doctrine was built around the coordinated full deckload strike. Attack bombers, dive bombers, and fighters went out together, arrived together, and attacked together, because a fraction of an air group arriving alone against a defended enemy achieves very little and is destroyed doing it. The Japanese had learned that in China and had built their entire carrier procedure around avoiding it. Aircraft were spotted on deck as a complete strike package, or they were not spotted at all. There was no established method for launching a partial strike, no doctrine for it, no practice at it. Nagumo also had a returning midway strike overhead, running low on fuel, that had to be recovered before anything could be spotted, because a carrier can land aircraft or launch them but not both. Refusing to recover them meant putting 100 aircraft and their crews into the sea in order to send off a fragment of a strike that his own doctrine said would be destroyed on arrival. Measured against the procedures he and his air staff had trained in for a decade, one course of action was open to him: recover the returning aircraft, complete the ordnance change, put a full coordinated strike into the air as a single package, and then go and find the American carrier with everything at once. He gave that order. It was correct under the doctrine he had, and the doctrine was the problem. 3 American dive bomber groups launched that morning to find the Japanese carriers. Only 2 of them arrived. The Hornets dive bombers, 30-odd aircraft, flew a course that took them past the enemy without ever making contact. They searched, ran short of fuel, and turned for home. Some reached the ship, some came down in the water, some diverted to Midway. They played no part in the battle at all. This is why the number of American dive bombers over the Japanese fleet that morning was 50 rather than 80-odd. And it is worth saying plainly, because the arithmetic of what those 50 aircraft achieved only makes sense once you know that a third of the striking force never got there. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise group, reached the position where the Japanese were supposed to be and found empty ocean. He was the air group commander, he was new to the job, and his fuel state was already marginal. The correct and expected decision was to turn for the carrier. He began a box search instead, flying outward along a new leg into water where nothing at all had been reported. On that second leg, he sighted a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, running north at high speed. She had been detached to hold down an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey turned to follow her course. At 22 minutes past 10, 33 Dauntlesses from the Enterprise came over the Japanese carriers from the southwest, and within moments, 17 more from the Yorktown arrived from a different bearing entirely. Neither group knew the other was coming. What followed immediately was a mistake. American doctrine for 2 squadrons attacking 2 targets was straightforward. The trailing squadron takes the near ship. The leading squadron takes the far one. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing 6, had positioned himself accordingly and was beginning his approach on the near carrier, the Akagi, expecting Scouting 6 to go past him to the Kaga. Instead, McCluskey, leading from Scouting 6, took his own squadron down onto the near ship, and most of Best's squadron followed the aircraft in front of them. The result was that the Kaga received an entire air group's worth of bombs. She was hit so many times in so short a span that the Japanese lost count of the hits, and no reliable figure has ever been established. Best broke off his dive. He had 2 wingmen with him and nobody else, and he took those 2 aircraft across to the Akagi and attacked her with 3 bombs against a ship of 40,000 tons. That is what killed the flagship of the Pearl Harbor strike force. Off to the northeast, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie brought Bombing 3 down on the Soryu. 4 of his 17 aircraft, including his own, had lost their bombs into the sea on the way out when faulty electric arming switches released them. Leslie dived anyway, without a bomb, ahead of the 13 aircraft that still had theirs, using his machine guns against the ship's anti-aircraft positions to make the runs behind him a fraction easier. The first bomb struck the flight deck squarely on the painted rising sun. Now the part the memoir got wrong. There were no flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft waiting to take off. The Japanese official history is explicit about it, and Japanese naval records confirm it. Not one of Nagumo's carriers had a strike ranged on deck. The aircraft were below, in the hangars, in the middle of an ordnance change, with the previous load of weapons not yet struck down to the magazines because the crews were working against the clock, and stowing ordnance properly takes time nobody had. That is why 3 carriers died from a handful of bombs. The bombs went through the flight decks and detonated inside enclosed hangar spaces containing aircraft, fuel lines, and loose ordnance. What followed was not a fire on a ship. It was a fire inside a sealed box full of explosives. American and Japanese carriers were built on opposite philosophies, and at Midway, the difference decided who survived being hit. Japanese fleet carriers used enclosed hangars structurally integrated into the hull, sealed against the weather. It is an efficient arrangement. It gives you strength, it protects your aircraft, and it lets you service them in any conditions. It also means that when a bomb detonates inside one, the blast has nowhere to go but along the hangar, through the ship, and up through the elevators, and the pressure cannot be vented because there is nothing to vent it through. American carriers used open hangar sides. The hangar deck was a covered space with roll-up shutters, open to the air. In a fire, the sides could be opened and the blast and the smoke could go out over the water. Aircraft could be pushed over the side. Fuel lines were drained and filled with inert gas as standard practice before action. Japanese damage control training was also thinner. Fire parties were smaller, less thoroughly drilled, and the equipment was not as good. Men died at their posts on all 4 of those ships, fighting fires that could not be fought. And the reason they could not be fought had been settled years earlier, in budget meetings, by men who never went to sea in these ships. Underneath that sits a difference about what a navy thinks a carrier is for. The Imperial Japanese Navy treated the carrier as a weapon of the first strike. Get the aircraft off, hit first, hit hardest, and settle the engagement before the enemy can reply. A ship built around that idea prioritizes how many aircraft it carries and how fast it can put them into the air. Armor over the hangar deck, redundant fire mains, compartmentalization that makes the hangar awkward to work in, all of it competes with those 2 things. And all of it was trimmed. The United States Navy had gone the other way, largely because of fleet exercises through the 1930s in which carriers repeatedly demonstrated how easy they were to find and how quickly they died once found. American carriers were designed on the assumption that they would be hit, and the design brief treated surviving the hit as part of the ship's job, rather than a failure of it. The Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi were finished by a weight of bombs that would not have stopped an American carrier of the same generation. Those were not badly built ships. They were built for a war in which they would always be the ones striking first, and on the 4th of June they were not. The first 2 sank that afternoon. The Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled before dawn. The officer who wrote the memoir was Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who was aboard the Akagi at Midway, unable to fly after an operation. His book was published in English in the 1950s and became the foundation of the American understanding of the Japanese side of this battle. 2 generations of historians built on it. It supplied the packed flight decks, the 5 minutes, and the specific, cinematic detail that made the scene so easy to picture and so hard to dislodge. Japanese historians have been considerably blunter about Fuchida than American ones, and the scholarly assessment now is that his account is unreliable in its particulars and invented in places. Nagumo's own battle report, meanwhile, was written by men with an obvious interest in how the loss of 4 carriers would be read in Tokyo. I find it worth sitting with the fact that the most widely believed account of the most studied battle in the Pacific War rested for half a century on the testimony of one man who had every reason to shape it, and that the correction came not from any new discovery, but simply from reading what the Japanese Navy had written down at the time. One Japanese carrier was still undamaged. The Hiryu had been operating somewhat apart from the other 3, and at midday she launched. Her first strike was dive bombers, and they found the Yorktown. 3 bombs hit. 1 went down the funnel and put out the boilers, and the ship came to a stop, with smoke pouring out of her, dead in the water, in the middle of an ocean where being stopped is a death sentence. The Yorktown's damage control parties then did something that deserves to be better known than it is. Working in a ship that was on fire and had no power, they patched the flight deck, restored steam to the boilers, and had her underway again inside an hour, making better than 15 knots. When the second Japanese strike arrived, torpedo bombers this time, the Yorktown was moving and fighting, and her attackers reported her as an undamaged carrier. They believed they had found a second ship, which meant the Japanese now thought the Americans had 3 carriers in the area rather than 2. The torpedoes did what the bombs had not. 2 hit on the port side, the ship lost power again, and she took on a list steep enough that Fletcher ordered her abandoned. She stayed afloat for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine finished her. The Hiryu had put 1 American carrier out of the battle with 2 strikes in an afternoon, having been left alone against a fleet that outnumbered her. Her air group did that with aircraft and crews that had already flown a full mission that morning. The Yorktown's own scout aircraft found the Hiryu shortly after the second strike went in. Spruance launched from the Enterprise at a little after 3 in the afternoon. 24 dive bombers, most of them survivors of the morning attack, several of them flown by pilots who had already been shot at over this same fleet 6 hours earlier and had come back and been rearmed and gone out again. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led them, and Best flew with them on what was his second attack on a Japanese carrier in a single day. They came in out of the sun at 5 o'clock. The Hiryu's fighter cover was up but out of position, and 4 bombs went into her forward flight deck. The forward elevator was blown out of its well and thrown against the bridge. She burned through the night and was scuttled the next morning. 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk in a single day by aircraft flying from 3 American ones. The exchange rate came down to 3 things: where the aircraft were stowed when the bombs arrived, how the ships were built to absorb a hit, and which admiral had known in advance where the other fleet would be. Yamamoto held the fleet in the area overnight, hoping to draw the Americans into a surface action where his battleships would matter. Spruance declined, kept his distance, and gave him nothing. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, collided while maneuvering to avoid an American submarine during the withdrawal and were caught by carrier aircraft the following day. The Mikuma was destroyed. Yamamoto ordered the operation cancelled and the fleet withdrawn on the 5th of June. The most durable belief about Midway is that it destroyed Japan's irreplaceable body of elite naval aviators, and that Japanese carrier aviation never recovered because the men were gone. The numbers do not say that. Japanese aircrew losses at Midway were around 110, which is roughly a quarter of the aircrew embarked in the 4 carriers, and it is a considerably smaller figure than most people expect. Japan's Carrier Aviator Corps was gutted, but it was gutted the following year in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, not in one morning in June. What Japan lost in numbers at Midway was something less visible and much harder to replace. 4 aircraft carriers went down with their entire ship's companies of aircraft maintenance personnel: the mechanics, the armorers, the electricians, the ordnance handlers, the men who kept 100 aircraft serviceable in a steel hangar in the middle of an ocean. Those men were trained over years, they existed in finite numbers, and Japan had no system for producing them in quantity. Aircraft could be built, pilots could be trained, badly and quickly, and were. The technical corps that kept carrier aviation functioning could not be reconstituted at all. For the rest of the war, Japanese carrier air groups suffered from serviceability rates that a 1942 air group would not have recognized. A squadron with 30 aircraft on paper might put 18 into the air, and the 18 would be the ones that happened to be working that week. Engines went unrebuilt, radios went unrepaired. Damage that a first-rate maintenance section would have turned around overnight took days, or was simply written off and the aircraft pushed aside. None of that shows up in an order of battle. A staff officer counting hulls and airframes would have concluded that Japanese carrier aviation had substantially recovered by 1943. What he could not count was the number of men aboard who genuinely knew how to keep a carrier air group flying at sea, and that number never came back. That was the wound, and it was inflicted by American bombs falling into hangar decks full of the men who worked there. 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed in the operation. Set the aviator figure against that total, and the shape of the loss becomes clear. The overwhelming majority of the dead had never flown anything. They were ships' companies, and inside the ships' companies of those 4 carriers was the entire embarked technical establishment of the Imperial Navy's 1st Carrier Division. Yamamoto had come to Midway in order to force a decisive engagement while the balance still favored him. He got his decisive engagement. What he had actually gambled was not 4 ships, but the trained core of an arm that Japan had spent 15 years assembling, and it went down inside the hulls in a single afternoon. 4 reasons, and every one of them was in place before the first aircraft took off. Japan divided its force across thousands of miles, so that at the decisive moment 4 carriers fought alone, while the rest of the fleet was elsewhere. Japanese carrier doctrine required a full coordinated strike and made no provision for launching a partial one, which put the aircraft below decks at the moment the American dive bombers arrived. Japanese carrier design used enclosed hangars, and Japanese damage control was less well-resourced, so that a small number of hits produced fires that could not be contained. And Yamamoto attacked a numerically superior force at the far end of his own supply lines, on the strength of an operations order that had already decided the enemy would not fight. The Americans, for their part, read the mail, arranged to be in the right place, and sent everything they had. 307 Americans were killed at Midway. They died in cockpits, in engine rooms, on an atoll under bombardment, and in the water alongside a sinking destroyer 2 days after the Japanese carriers had gone down. A great many of the aircrew among them were lost in the first 2 hours of the 4th of June, flying obsolete machines without escort, and achieving nothing that showed on any chart that day. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific, on a flight deck, in a hangar, in an engine room, in a squadron that nobody has written a book about, leave his name in the comments. Leave his unit. Leave whatever part of his story you still carry. This is a good place for it.
Dawn, Waimanalo Beach on the eastern shore of Oahu. December 8, 1941, the morning after. A National Guard corporal named David Akui is walking the surf line with a rifle. Something rolls in with the waves. He thinks it's a sea turtle. It's a man. He's a Japanese naval officer. The day before, while the bombs were still falling on Pearl Harbor, he tried to take a submarine into that harbor to help finish the job. Now he's face down in the sand, and he's still breathing. When he wakes up, in an American hospital, under an American guard, the first thing he asks for is a way to kill himself. The Americans tell him no. His own country gives him a different answer. Japan strikes his name from the record. It scrubs his face out of a photograph. It leaves his mother in silence, and later sends him letters telling him he should be dead. 2 countries, 1 man, the opposite response. 50 years later, that same man will stand in a quiet room in Texas and break down crying in front of a submarine, the one that carried him to this beach. How he got from the surf at Waimanalo to that room in Texas, and what it says about the men who wore the same uniform your father wore, that says what this is. If it's a story you'd rather didn't disappear, the like button is the thing that keeps it from disappearing. His own country tried to erase him once. We don't have to. He was 23 years old, Kazuo Sakamaki, an ensign in the Imperial Japanese Navy. 68th class of the Naval Academy, graduated the year before, the second of 8 brothers. He used to say, a long time afterward, that the size of his family was part of why they chose him. He was one of 10 men picked for something the Japanese Navy had never tried in battle: 5 small submarines, 78 feet of steel, 2 men to a crew, a single hatch barely wide enough for a man to drop through. They would be carried most of the way to Hawaii on the backs of larger submarines, cut loose in the dark about 10 miles off the coast, and sent in underneath the harbor while the airplanes came down from above. Each little boat carried 2 torpedoes. Each one was meant to find a battleship. When it was finished, when the torpedoes were gone and the harbor was burning, the crews were supposed to slip back out the way they came and meet the larger submarines waiting for them miles offshore. That was the plan on paper. It was the part no one really believed in. Not one of the 10 men would ever make that rendezvous. The man who led the air attack, Mitsuo Fuchida, argued against sending the submarines at all. He thought they would be spotted before the planes ever arrived and give the whole thing away. The night before they launched, the men did what men in their position did. Sakamaki wrote a last letter to his father. He cut a lock of his own hair and clipped his fingernails, and he left them behind. The things a family keeps when there will be no body to bury. Nobody on those crews expected to come home. That was understood going in. That was, in a way, the whole idea. At 3:30 in the morning on December 7th, the mother submarine I-24 let HA-19 go. The trouble started almost at once. The gyro compass, the one instrument that told Sakamaki which way his boat was pointed in the black water, failed. From that moment on, everything he did was a guess. He had to raise the periscope again and again just to find the island, and every time he did, he risked being seen. He was not the only one in trouble that morning. Out at the mouth of the harbor, one of the other midget submarines was spotted by the destroyer USS Ward. The Ward opened fire and sank it at 6:37, more than an hour before the first bomb fell. Her captain sent word up the chain that he had fired on a submarine in a defensive sea zone, and someone, somewhere, decided it was a mistake and set the report aside. The warning America needed was sitting on a desk before the attack ever began. Fuchida had been right. Nobody acted on it. Sakamaki, blind without his compass, ran his submarine onto a coral reef, then a second time, then a third. Around 8:15, with the harbor already burning behind him, the destroyer USS Helm caught sight of the little boat stuck fast on the rocks and fired. The shells missed, but the blast knocked Sakamaki out cold, and it shook the submarine loose off the reef. When he came to, the boat was free. It was also finished. The impact had crushed both torpedo tubes flat. He had spent the whole of that day crammed inside a steel tube the size of a closet, and now he had nothing to shoot. What he had instead was poison. Seawater had gotten down into the battery compartment, and seawater on those batteries gives off chlorine gas. It filled the hull. Both men passed out from it, came around, and passed out again as the crippled boat drifted east around the island. American destroyers found them through the day and dropped depth charges. The sea hammered the hull. The gas kept coming, and the 2 men inside kept waking up to the very same situation, hour after hour, with no way out and no way to fight. By evening they were off Bellows Field, and the boat ran aground for the last time. There was nothing left to do but destroy it and swim. Sakamaki set the scuttling charges. The explosives meant to send the submarine and everything inside it to the bottom, so the Americans would never have it. He and Inagaki went over the side into the surf. The charges never went off. The same seawater that had filled the boat with gas had soaked them too. Kiyoshi Inagaki did not make it through the waves. He drowned in the surf, just short of the shore he had been swimming for. Sakamaki made it. He washed up onto the sand on the eastern side of Oahu, and he did not get up. Everything he had been sent to do had failed. His torpedoes were crushed. His submarine sat whole on a reef, where the Americans would tow it in and read every chart inside it. His crewmate was dead in the water behind him, and he was alive. For a man raised the way he had been raised, that was the worst part of all. That was where the morning would find him. He did not wake up on that beach. When the corporal found him at first light, Sakamaki was unconscious, finished off by the gas, the depth charges, and a night and a day of trying to reach a target he never reached. David Akui was 21 years old, a corporal in the 298th Infantry, Hawaii National Guard. He was not a hero. Nothing about that morning had prepared him for what the tide brought in. He had a rifle in his hands. He had an enemy at his feet who could not stand up. There were a great many things a man could have done on an empty beach, the morning after Pearl Harbor still smoking across the island, and every reason in the world to hate the body lying in the surf. What Akui did was call for help. A lieutenant named Paul Plebon came down to the beach with a few men. They bound the prisoner's hands. They lifted him, carried him, really, because his legs were gone, and they laid him in the back of a jeep. Then they drove him to a hospital. That was the first decision, the smallest one anybody made in this whole story. And it was already a different decision than the man in the jeep would have made with the roles reversed. Sakamaki came to under a roof, in a bed, with an armed American standing in the room. His first clear feeling was not relief. It was shame. He had crossed an ocean expecting to die. He had made his peace with it. The letter to his father, the lock of hair left on the family altar. He had been raised to believe that a captured officer was no longer a man at all, and now here he was, alive, in another country's hospital, being looked after by the very people he had come to kill. He had been told what capture meant. He believed it. He expected to be beaten, questioned under torture, and then put to death in some degrading way. That was the story he had been handed, and he had no reason to doubt it. What came instead was a clean bed and a guard whose job was to keep him in it. So he asked them to let him die. He asked more than once. He wanted the one thing his training demanded of a captured officer. He asked the Americans, in plain terms, for a way to end his own life. They told him no. They told him no, and they kept telling him no. And so he turned it on himself the only way that was left. By his own account, before they took the photograph that would mark him as prisoner of war number 1, he pressed a lit cigarette into his own face, burned both cheeks, a man punishing himself for the crime of still breathing. They took the picture. They wrote down a number, prisoner number 1, the first Japanese serviceman captured alive by the United States in the entire war, a war that was one day old. They moved him to a small cell on Sand Island, in Honolulu Harbor, and he stayed there close to 3 months. He was alone in a way that few men ever are. 10 men had gone out in those 5 submarines. 9 of them were dead. He was the only one left, the single survivor of an operation that had been built, from the start, on the certainty that none of them would come back. Every other man had done what he was supposed to do. He was the one who hadn't, because a compass failed and the sea would not let him drown. In those first of Cass weeks he thought about death almost without stopping. How to manage it. When. Whether the guard would look away long enough. The guard did not look away. That was the job, week after week, for the young Americans posted to that cell. Their assignment that winter was not to break this man. It was not even to make him talk. It was to keep an enemy alive. An enemy who had come to sink their ships, who wanted nothing now but to die, and who would have thanked them for the chance. They fed him. They watched him. They made sure the man who could not stand his own survival lived to see the next morning. And the morning after that, nobody handed them a medal for it. Nobody wrote their names down. And this is the part worth slowing down for. The United States had just been attacked with no warning at all. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. The country had every reason, every excuse anyone could ask for, to look at the one enemy it held in its hands and decide he was not worth the food it would take to keep him breathing. It decided the other way, quietly, with no argument. A corporal on a beach, a lieutenant with a jeep, a doctor, a guard at a cell door, not one of them an important man, every one of them without being ordered to, reaching for the same answer. They kept him. Why a nation living through the worst morning in its history would spend its men and its time keeping its enemy breathing. Sakamaki would carry that question for the rest of his life. Half a world away, his own country was already answering a very different question about him. In the world Sakamaki came from, there was no such thing as an honorable prisoner. The code drilled into every Japanese serviceman, the one he had recited, the one he believed without question, offered a man exactly two endings: victory or a clean death. There was no third door. Capture was not a misfortune that could happen to a brave man. It was evidence that something inside him had given way. Every one of those 10 submariners had gone out understanding that. They had not expected to come back. They had been taught to want the opposite, to choose, when the moment came, between winning and dying well. 9 of them got the ending they had been promised. And the Navy knew exactly what to do with 9 dead men. It promoted all 9 of them, 2 ranks each. It turned their portraits into posters, their names into somethings school children would learn. It held their deaths up to the whole country as the purest thing a man could offer. Proof of the spirit that was going to carry Japan through the war. It gave them a title that lifted them out of the ranks of ordinary men. The 9 war gods. There is a photograph from that time. You can still find it today. 9 young men in their uniforms posed together, solemn and proud, fixed forever as the heroes of Pearl Harbor. There had been 10. The 10th was Kazuo Sakamaki. And before that picture went out to the newspapers and the schoolrooms, the Navy took him out of it. Mitsuo Fuchida, the officer who had led the air attack, the one who had argued against sending the submarines in the first place, wrote afterward that the Navy scrubbed Sakamaki's face out of the photograph before they let the country see it. 10 men went out. 9 came home as gods. The one who lived was the one they erased. A dead hero confirmed everything the country believed about itself. A living prisoner threatened it. If one man could be captured and go on breathing, then the choice was never really only victory or death. There was a third door after all, and the whole machinery of the thing depended on no one being allowed to see it. A single living prisoner was a more dangerous thing, in its way, than a lost battle. A lost battle could be avenged. A man who had surrendered and was still breathing was a hole in the story itself, so they closed it. They painted him out. His family was told that his fate was unknown. It was not unknown. The Navy had good reason to believe he had been taken alive. But the truth did not fit the story the country needed in the winter of 1941, and they told her to say nothing. The families of the 9 were visited and honored, held up in their towns as the people who had given the country its gods. Sakamaki's family got the opposite of a ceremony. They got a silence they were ordered to keep. Somewhere in Tokushima, a woman went on, not knowing whether her boy was living or dead, because the truth was the one thing the empire could not afford to let her keep. I think about that other man sometimes, not Sakamaki, the guard, the young American whose whole job, that winter, was to sit outside a cell and keep an enemy alive who was begging to die and who never once turned up in a photograph or a citation or a single line of any history book. Nobody wrote his name down. But that was America too, standing in a hallway at 4 in the morning, refusing to let a man throw his life away just because somebody on the far side of the ocean had taught him that he had to. To understand what happened to Sakamaki next, you have to know what the word prisoner meant in this particular war. On the other side of it, it meant something close to a death sentence. Of the roughly 27,000 American servicemen who fell into Japanese hands during the Second World War, more than 11,000 never came home. They starved. They were worked past the point a body can go. They were beaten, or left to die of things a little medicine would have cured. More than 4 out of every 10. That was what surrender meant if you wore an American uniform, and the men who took you were Japanese. If you want to know what that number looked like up close, it looked like the Bataan Death March. The spring of 1942, tens of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners, driven on foot through the heat of the Philippines, with no food and almost no water, beaten as they walked, bayoneted when they stumbled, shot and left in the ditch when they could not keep up. That was the same army, working from the same code, that had sent Kazuo Sakamaki to Hawaii. That was the world Sakamaki came from, and the welcome he braced for. He waited for it. It never came. They took him off Hawaii and brought him to the mainland. A camp in Wisconsin first, then Camp Livingston down in Louisiana, then others. He was the first Japanese prisoner the country had, and a useful one. His submarine had been pulled off that reef nearly whole, with its charts and its papers still inside. A clean look at exactly how Japan had planned the underwater half of the Pearl Harbor attack. It was the kind of windfall an intelligence officer dreams about and almost never gets. Handed over, whole, sitting on a reef. The questioners had a great deal to ask him, and they came back with their questions again and again. So America got what it needed out of Kazuo Sakamaki. The charts, the answers, everything he knew. And here is where the whole story turns, quietly, on a thing most people would walk right past. After they had it, after he had nothing left to give them, nothing changed. They kept feeding him. More food by his own account than he had seen in a long while. They kept treating his ailments. They kept him in conditions a man could actually live in. The questioning ended, his usefulness ended, and the plain decency just went on, day after day, asking for nothing back. That was the thing he could not make sense of. He had braced for cruelty and been given a cot. He had offered them his life, and they had refused to take it. He had handed over his intelligence, and they had not thrown him away the moment it was spent. None of it fit anything he had been trained to expect. The only explanation left, the one he fought off for a long time, and then could not fight off any longer, was that these people simply did not believe a beaten enemy was worth less than a man, and it was not aimed at him in particular. There was nothing personal in it. It was just the way these people were, and that, in the end, was almost harder to take than cruelty would have been. Cruelty he could have understood. Cruelty he had been promised. Somewhere in those long months, in a camp in the middle of a country he had been raised to hate, Sakamaki made a decision. He decided to live. He started with the language. He taught himself English, slowly at first, then well. And then he did something that ought to stop you cold, given where he began. The man who had begged for a way to kill himself became the man who talked other men out of it. As the war went on and more Japanese were captured and shipped into the camps, they came in carrying the same shame he had carried, reaching for the same exit. Tens of thousands of them would pass into Allied hands before it was over, and he was the first of all of them. Prisoner number 1. He sat with those men and argued them back from the edge. "Stay alive," he told them. "There is no honor waiting for you on the other side of that." He spent himself on it. Years later, he counted it among the things he was proudest of in his entire life. How many of them he had kept breathing. The country that was supposed to break him had instead handed him a reason to keep going. And he was passing it down the line. While Sakamaki was learning English in Louisiana, his submarine was out on the road. The Navy had hauled H-19 back to the mainland and turned it into something nobody had quite seen before. They cut viewing ports into the side of the hull so people could see in. They posed mannequins in Japanese uniforms at the controls. They set the whole thing on a flat car and sent it across the country to sell war bonds. It traveled to something close to 2,000 cities and towns, 41 states. For 3 years it crossed America, county fairs, train depots, courthouse squares, and ordinary people stood in line and paid for the chance to climb up and look inside the little steel boat that had come to kill them and failed. The campaign brought in millions of dollars. The president himself was photographed standing beside it. In the spring of 1943, they hauled it into the middle of New York City for a war bond rally, and the crowds came for that too. There may be people watching this whose mother or father stood in front of that submarine as a child, in a town square in Ohio, in Texas, in Nebraska, holding a parent's hand, staring at the enemy's own weapon, hauled out into the daylight in the middle of Main Street, with a line of Americans behind them waiting their turn. And 1,000 miles inland, the man who had ridden that boat across the Pacific was teaching himself the language of the people filing past it, and quietly turning into one of the reasons the prisoners around him were still alive. The war ended in the summer of 1945. In January of 1946, they sent Kazuo Sakamaki home. He came back to a country that no longer looked like the one he had left. The cities were ash. The empire that had erased him was gone, occupied, broken open. American soldiers were a common sight on the streets now, in the train stations and outside the ministries, the keepers of a country that had sworn it would never be kept by anyone, and the people who had been told for 4 years that their sons all chose death over capture, now had to look at a man who had done the opposite and lived. They did not welcome him. The letters came. Strangers wrote to tell him that the souls of his dead comrades were weeping over what he had done, that he had shamed them by going on breathing, and that the decent thing, the only thing left to him, was to finish what he had failed to finish at Pearl Harbor and take his own life. He had spent 4 years among the people he had been raised to think of as monsters. He came home to find that the ones telling him to die were his own. He did not take their advice. He went to work instead. He took a job with an automobile company you have heard of, Toyota. And the thing that made him useful to them was the thing he had picked up inside, a prison camp in Louisiana. English, the language he had taught himself behind American wire, became the tool he used to sell Japanese cars to the rest of the world. He was good at it. By 1969, they had put him in charge of their operation in Brazil. He spent years abroad, came home to Japan in 1983, and retired in 1987, an executive, a husband, a father, an old man with a long and ordinary life behind him. For anyone old enough to remember what Made in Japan came to mean in the decades after the war, there is an irony here worth naming out loud. The first Japanese prisoner the United States ever took, the man America refused to let die, grew up to help build the company that would one day go fender to fender with Detroit. He and his wife raised children. He gave his first son a name, Kiyoshi, the same name as the man who had drowned in the surf beside him off Bellows Field, the crewmate he had left in the water. His son would wonder, later, whether he had been named for that man on purpose. The boy grew up under the weight of his father's story. People called him the son of a coward. And in time that son stood up in front of rooms full of people and spoke, not about shame, but about understanding, about forgiveness, about setting a thing down. Whatever the Americans had put into his father in that camp, it had carried far enough to reach a child who had not been born yet when it happened. For 45 years, Sakamaki would not speak about any of it in public. He raised his family, did his work, grew old, and kept the whole thing folded away somewhere no one could reach it. Then, in 1991, he agreed to attend a conference in a small town in Texas, Fredericksburg, the hometown of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the man who had commanded the fleet that beat Japan. They had built a museum there, and inside that museum, kept and cleaned and labeled like the piece of history it was, sat a submarine. A 19, the same boat, the one that had carried him onto that reef half a century before. America had not scrapped it. America had not sunk it or buried it. America had kept it, every rivet of it, and set it under a roof where people could come and learn what it had been. They brought the old man into the room, and he saw it, and something in him gave way. 45 years of silence, and most of a lifetime since that beach. And Kazuo Sakamaki stood in front of his own submarine, in Texas, and wept like the boy who had once climbed into it. Here is the whole thing in one frame. His own country scrubbed his face out of a single photograph, so that no one would ever have to know that he had lived. America kept the entire submarine, and 50 years later it brought him into the room and let him stand in front of it and cry. And the corporal? David Akui, the young guardsman who found him in the surf that first morning. He went on to the war. He served in the Pacific with Merrill's marauders, deep in the Burmese jungle, in some of the worst fighting there was, and he came through it. And in all the years afterward, when the chance came to meet the famous prisoner he had pulled out of the sea, the one piece of history he could have stepped forward and claimed, he turned it down every time. He had done a thing on a beach one morning, and then he had gone and done his job, and he never asked for anything in return for either one. You will not find him in most tellings of this story, and that is really what this was about. Not Sakamaki, the men around him, the corporal on the beach, the lieutenant with the jeep, the guard at the cell door who kept a stranger alive against the stranger's own will, the cook who fed a man who had come to sink his ships, not one of them famous, not one of them decorated for it. Men who simply could not bring themselves to be cruel to an enemy who was already finished, because of how they were raised, and where, and by whom. They wore the same uniform your father wore. So let me ask you the thing I always ask. If your father was in the Pacific, Navy, Marines, Army, the Army Air Forces, or your grandfather, or an uncle whose chair was already empty by the time you were old enough to ask. He most likely came home and said almost nothing, or he said one thing, once, at the dinner table, and never said it again. History didn't write their names down either, so write his down here, his name, where he served. And one thing he said, or did, or could never quite bring himself to talk about. Leave it in the comments, where it won't go quiet when the last of them does. And subscribe if you'd like the next one. There are far more of these men than there are videos. We are not going to get to all of them in time.
The most basic concept of survival for the United States Navy's submarine force in the early years of the Second World War was encapsulated in a single unwritten rule. When you spot an Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer, dive deep and pray. Destroyers were apex surface predators designed specifically to crush the steel hulls of submarines. They possessed a superior speed of up to 35 knots, highly sensitive sonar systems, and depth charge racks carrying devastating payloads. A direct confrontation between a slow-moving submarine and a heavily armed destroyer was universally regarded by military tacticians as an act of suicide. The history of the Pacific Theater from 1941 to early 1944 was defined by the relentless persecution of the silent service. But at a submarine base in the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1944, a bloody paradigm shift was about to begin. The Gato-class fleet submarine designated SS-257, the USS Harder, was moored for refueling and rearmament. Commanding the boat, was Commander Samuel Dealey. He was a 38-year-old officer with chiseled features and eyes that betrayed a cold, calculating nature. Up to this point, the Harder had sent 9 Japanese merchant vessels to the bottom, 9 white tally marks painted on her conning tower. It was a respectable figure, but not the stuff of legend. Slow-moving tankers could not fight back. They were mere pawns on the oceanic chessboard. However, the entire landscape of the undersea war was permanently altered on April 12, 1944. While patrolling beneath the surface around the Caroline Islands, the Harder's radio room received a decrypted message from Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, had issued an order that overturned years of core operational doctrine. The dispatch completely lifted the ban on engaging enemy escort vessels. Lockwood declared his intent with a chilling directive. The time had come to tear down the destroyer screens. Inside the cramped control room, heavy with the stench of diesel fuel and stale sweat, Samuel Dealey read the dispatch under the red rig for dark lighting. He did not say a word. There was no cheering or excitement among the officers present. The decision was made in absolute silence. The Mark 14 torpedoes in the forward torpedo room were ordered for immediate gyro compass alignment checks. The USS Harder began to alter her course, deliberately heading straight into the notorious patrol routes of the Japanese Navy. 7 p.m. on April 13th. The Pacific sky was fading into a pale twilight. The sea state was calm. The bridge lookout on the Harder spotted a faint trail of black smoke stretching across the horizon. The optical rangefinder initially established the distance at 15,000 yards. The target was closing at high speed. Identification through the periscope confirmed it was the Ikazuchi, a veteran Fubuki-class destroyer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The warship boasted a displacement of nearly 2,000 tons, armed with 6 5-inch naval guns and a massive arsenal of depth charges lined along her aft deck. The Ikazuchi was no sluggish transport. She was a dedicated killer that had participated in countless bloody campaigns since the very first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. The radar screen on the Harder flickered relentlessly. The return signal indicated that the lookouts on the Ikazuchi had already spotted the American boat. A massive white bow wave erupted from the front of the destroyer as she executed a hard turn. She was aiming her steel bow directly at the submarine's coordinates to prepare for a ramming maneuver or to deliver a barrage of depth charges. According to the standard reflexes drilled during thousands of hours at the Annapolis Naval Academy, this was the exact moment a commanding officer would scream the order to crash dive. The klaxon would howl. The main ballast tank vents would be thrown open, allowing seawater to flood in and drag the hull down to a safe depth. 15 seconds before the first depth charges detonated, but Samuel Dealey stood perfectly still next to the primary periscope housing. His hands gripped the grease-coated brass handles. His eyes remained glued to the optics without blinking. He ordered the diving officer to maintain current depth. The 2,400-ton steel hull of the Harder hovered just beneath the waves, exposing only the fragile optical tube cutting through the dark water. Inside the conning tower, the silence was so absolute that one could clearly hear the ragged breathing of the plainsman. The temperature inside the steel pressure hull spiked to over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but no one noticed. All attention was entirely focused on the torpedo data computer operator. Complex mechanical gears clicked continuously, calculating the target's track angle, speed, and range. Through the hydrophones, the sonar man reported the cold, rhythmic pinging echoing through the hull. It was the active sonar of the Ikazuchi hunting for their steel casing. The high-pitched whine of the destroyer's triple-blade propellers grew louder by the second, roaring through the thin pressure hull. The sound reverberated against their eardrums like an electric freight train barreling into a closed room. The range dropped to 5,000 yards. The Ikazuchi loomed massive and lethal in the periscope lens. 3,000 yards. The deck guns on the Japanese warship had begun to depress, scanning the surface for a target. 1,500 yards. It was far too late to dive and escape. The Harder was now locked in an irreversible death spiral. Either they destroyed the enemy, or all 80 men would be crushed by thousands of tons of water pressure at the bottom of the abyss. 1859 hours. The distance from the periscope to the enemy's bow was exactly 900 yards, an incredibly extreme and suicidal range in naval warfare. This distance was known among submariners by a bloody moniker, the down-the-throat shot. Dealey stepped back from the periscope. His voice rang out in the dry, sterile air of the control room, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. The submarine's steel structure shuddered violently with each press of the firing button. Compressed air forced 4 torpedoes, each weighing over 3,000 pounds, out of the forward tubes. Their counter-rotating propellers tore through the water, leaving 4 distinct wakes of white foam on the dark sea, heading straight for the bow of the charging destroyer. The officer of the deck on the Ikazuchi saw the white wakes of death approaching in the twilight. The helm was ordered hard over in a state of absolute desperation. The massive ship listed heavily to port, but her immense physical mass could not outmaneuver the 30-knot speed of the intercepting torpedoes. 10 seconds after leaving the tubes, 2 of the 4 torpedoes slammed into the side of the Ikazuchi. A deafening explosion shattered the surface of the Caroline Sea. A column of water shot dozens of feet into the air, carrying jagged, red-hot shrapnel with it. The massive payload of Torpex explosive blew a catastrophic hole deep below the destroyer's waterline. Seawater flooded violently into the lower engine rooms. The central boiler system detonated due to the sudden temperature drop, creating a secondary shockwave that completely broke the ship's back. There was no time to launch lifeboats. No abandoned ship order could be broadcast over the public address system. The colossal steel beast rolled over and plunged into the dark ocean in less than 5 minutes. The Ikazuchi was wiped off the map, taking her entire crew down to a bottomless grave. Aboard the USS Harder, the suffocating silence gave way to stunned stares in the control room. They had just achieved the impossible. They had turned a bloodthirsty apex predator into a helpless victim in the blink of an eye. But for Commander Samuel Dealey, sinking the Ikazuchi was not the end of a campaign. The smell of cordite and the sound of rending metal under water pressure seemed to have awakened a dangerous primal instinct within this stoic commander. The hunt had just begun. Immediately, the boat was ordered to change course. Navigational charts were unrolled. The submarine laid in a course straight for the East Indies, heading toward the heavily armored anchorage of the Japanese combined fleet. At the Tawi-Tawi fleet anchorage, surrounded by the most advanced destroyers, the USS Harder would voluntarily enter a far more brutal wager. A dark chapter was about to unfold, one that would not only shake the entire paradigm of the undersea war, but would test the absolute limits of both steel machinery and the human nervous system until they shattered. The waters of the East Indies in early June 1944 were not a forgiving place, particularly the Tawi-Tawi anchorage, the massive fortified staging ground of the Japanese combined fleet. The naval forces of the Empire were gathering here in preparation for a strategic, decisive naval battle in the Philippine Sea. Around the islands loomed the dark silhouettes of colossal battleships. Their defensive perimeter was tightly secured by dozens of elite destroyers. Any lone submarine wandering into these waters was effectively signing its own death warrant. But the USS Harder had not wandered in by mistake. Under the command of Samuel Dealey, the boat was actively prowling right at the gates of hell. The night of June 6th, the sea was eerily calm. The black steel hull of the Harder sliced quietly through the surface waters on patrol to recharge her electric batteries. The radar screen suddenly bloomed with interference. The sonar shack reported propeller noises from a slow-moving convoy heading south, consisting of 3 empty oil tankers and 2 escorting destroyers. Dealey immediately ordered flank speed on the surface. He intended to maneuver the Harder ahead of the enemy formation to establish a perfect ambush position. The massive diesel engines roared, pushing the boat through the darkness. But the elements betrayed them. A perfectly full moon slowly rose above the eastern horizon, casting a cold, silvery light over the dark ocean. The seawater-drenched hull of the Harder instantly caught the moonlight, turning the boat into a glowing slab of metal in the open sea. Immediately, the lookouts on the destroyer Minazuki spotted the target. Without a second of hesitation, the Minazuki broke from the tanker escort formation. Her razor-sharp bow cleaved the waves, engines throttling up to maximum speed to execute a direct ramming maneuver meant to crush the American submarine. The atmosphere inside the Harder's control room froze once again. The diving klaxon remained silent. Instead of frantically fleeing or diving deep to the ocean floor, Samuel Dealey made a decision that was ruthless in its cold calculation. He ordered the propeller revolutions reduced to a bare minimum, causing the boat to crawl like a ghost. Then, the rudder was put hard over. The submarine swung laterally, exposing its fragile broadside before slowly bringing its fore-aft torpedo tubes to bear directly on the charging Minazuki. It was an apocalyptic game of chicken. Dealey was engaging in a psychological test of nerves with the Japanese warship commander. He waited. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The Minazuki grew massive in the optical lens. White water boiled up from the destroyer's bow, carrying terrifying mechanical momentum. If the torpedoes missed, that thousands of tons of steel would bisect the Harder. If Dealey ordered a dive at this range, the 15 seconds required to flood the ballast tanks would be far too slow. The depth charges would be dropped squarely on the conning tower. 9:59 p.m. The distance had been closed to an extreme limit. The sweltering heat radiating from the electronic systems mixed with the cold sweat on the brows of the plotting officers. Only when the dark silhouette of the Minazuki completely filled the circular reticle did Dealey's dry voice cut through the silence. Fire all aft tubes. 3 torpedoes tore through the still waters of the Tawi-Tawi Sea. The point-blank range rendered the Japanese warship's evasive capabilities completely useless. 2 torpedoes smashed directly into the center of the Minazuki's hull. The explosive force of thousands of pounds of torpex ignited a massive, brilliant fireball in the moonlit night. A towering column of water collapsed downward, breaking the destroyer's spine. Buried beneath the endless cacophony of rending, shattering metal were the screams of hundreds of burning sailors. But the ocean did not grant Dealey any time to celebrate. Before the Minazuki had even fully slipped beneath the waves, the Harder's radar howled with deafening intensity. Capitalizing on the illumination from the explosion, the second destroyer, named Wakatsuki, had pinpointed their exact location and was charging in at a frenzied speed to exact revenge. Once again, Dealey did not back down. The blood of the hunt was boiling in his veins. He held his position, waiting for the Wakatsuki to enter the crosshairs before unleashing all 6 forward torpedoes. 10:42 p.m. The torpedoes left their tubes racing forward, but this time the captain of the Wakatsuki was prepared. The ship executed a spectacular hard turn, slipping past all 6 white wakes of death by a mere fraction of a margin. The gates of hell swung wide open for the crew of the USS Harder. There were no torpedoes loaded in the tubes. A furious destroyer was bearing down on them from a distance measured in mere hundreds of yards. Crash dive. The order was barked out. The klaxon tore through the silence. The main ballast vents were thrown completely open. The boat pitched forward at a steep, violent angle, 90 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet. But the Wakatsuki was already directly overhead. The roar of her propellers pierced the steel hull like the grinding teeth of a colossal mechanical beast. And then the depth charges began to fall. The entire Tawi-Tawi Sea felt as if it were being violently lifted by tectonic fractures originating from the ocean floor. Massive shock waves ripped through the water, slamming directly into the submarine's pressure hull. The USS Harder was violently thrown upward and then slammed back, down like a tin toy. At a depth of 300 feet, the external water pressure reached terrifying levels. Every square inch of the steel hull had to endure the crushing weight of tons of water. Light bulbs across all compartments shattered simultaneously. Thick darkness swallowed the 80 men whole. High-pressure valves hissed and screamed. The rivets on the bulkheads began to crack, and freezing seawater, heavy with the smell of brine, sprayed forcefully like knives into the engine room. Cork insulation rained down from the ceiling onto the heads of the sailors who lay clinging desperately to the rusting deck plates. They were waiting for the next barrel of explosives to land squarely on the conning tower, which would permanently turn this vessel into a sealed, armored coffin. It was a nightmare that lasted for hours, draining their physical endurance and completely eroding the boundaries of their sanity. By some miracle of mechanical engineering and sheer unadulterated luck, the Harder's steel hull held. They slipped through the cold thermoclines deep beneath the sea and managed to lose the Wakatsuki by the narrowest of margins. But that suffocating escape did not deter Samuel Dealey. Despite the structural fatigue of the mechanical systems and the severely depleted oxygen levels, just 1 day later, he threw the boat back into the crucible. Dealey allowed the destroyer Hayanami to close to within 650 yards before blowing it out of the water with a magazine explosion so catastrophic that the resulting shockwave nearly capsized the submarine itself. 3 days later, in the ultimate display of madness, Dealey engaged 2 destroyers simultaneously, sinking the Tanakaze with shots fired at point-blank range. In the span of a mere 4 days, 3 cutting-edge destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were obliterated in direct head-to-head duels. A bloody, glorious track record and entirely unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. But behind the cold, clinical action, reports cabled back to Submarine Command, a silent tragedy was unfolding inside the steel hull of the Harder. The burden of constantly dragging 80 lives across the razor-thin line between survival and annihilation was destroying Samuel Dealey's nervous system. The archives of the United States Navy still hold a detailed report handwritten by his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Lynch. The ink recorded a reality that the wartime propaganda machine always sought to conceal. Lynch observed that his captain was beginning to exhibit unmistakable signs of severe combat fatigue. Dealey became abnormally indifferent to and reckless with the most basic maritime safety protocols. He ignored Japanese anti-submarine countermeasures. Worse still, there were moments right in the climax of an attack where Lynch saw Dealey fall into a state of mute paralysis, his eyes vacant, completely incapable of making vital operational decisions. The long days exposing himself to the depth, charge barrages at Tawi-Tawi, the sound of steel fracturing under deep-sea pressure, combined with the crushing weight of maintaining the title of destroyer killer, had hollowed out this commander from the inside. His physical body still stood on the bridge, but his mind seemed to have been swallowed by the darkness of the ocean. A man of flesh and blood was slowly disintegrating under the heavy weight of a metal. At 5:32 on the morning of August 24, 1944, the sonar operator aboard the American submarine USS Harder pressed his headphones tightly against his ears. Through the static of the deep water, he detected the distinct rhythmic thrashing of bronze propellers cutting through the ocean. 15 violent depth charge explosions followed shortly after, tearing through the acoustic channels of the Philippine Sea. When the shockwaves finally faded into the vast emptiness of the Pacific, absolute silence returned. It was a profound, suffocating silence. It was the last sound the world would ever hear from Commander Samuel Dealey and the 80 men of the USS Harder. To understand the anatomy of this final tragedy, one must rewind to the docks of Fremantle, Australia, 3 weeks earlier. The USS Harder had returned from the nightmare of the Tawi-Tawi anchorage. The boat was physically battered, and her crew was psychologically exhausted. Naval regulations dictated that Samuel Dealey be relieved of command to recover from severe combat fatigue. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, noticing the vacant stares and the trembling hands of his top submarine ace, had actually drafted the paperwork to transfer command to Dealey's executive officer. But Dealey vehemently refused. He argued with the admiral, insisting he needed to lead one final patrol to shepherd a newly formed submarine wolf pack. The high command, blinded by the aura of the destroyer killer, made a fatal concession. They allowed a man whose nerves were entirely frayed to step back onto the bridge of a war machine. On August 5th, the Harder slipped her moorings, accompanied by the submarines USS Hake and USS Hado. They formed a wolf pack operating under Dealey's direct tactical command. Their destination was the South China Sea, specifically the perilous waters off the coast of the Philippines, a vital maritime artery for the retreating Japanese Empire. The early days of the patrol were marked by ruthless efficiency. On August 21st, the American wolf pack intercepted a Japanese convoy in Palawan Bay. They devastated the enemy formation, sending 4 merchant ships to the bottom. The next evening, the Harder independently sank 2 coastal defense frigates. 24 hours later, the USS Hake crippled the Japanese destroyer Asakaze. By the early morning hours of August 24th, the Harder and the Hake had rendezvoused off Dassault Bay. They were operating on the surface, hunting for the crippled Asakaze, unaware that the Japanese destroyer had already sunk hours earlier. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. The sea was draped in a thick gray mist. At exactly 5:32, radar screens on both American submarines picked up incoming surface contacts from the southeast. Through the powerful optical binoculars on the bridge, 2 distinct silhouettes emerged from the fog. One was a large warship, the other was a smaller, highly maneuverable escort vessel. The larger ship presented a bizarre and chilling irony of naval warfare. Through the periscope, the officers on the USS Hake identified the vessel as Patrol Boat 102 of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But its silhouette was unmistakably American. It was a Clemson-class 4-stack destroyer. This ship was originally the USS Stuart, an American warship that had been heavily damaged and scuttled in a dry dock in Java in 1942. The Japanese had salvaged her, repaired her hull, mounted their own deck guns, and turned the ghost of an American warship against its former masters. Escorting this captured prize was the Kaiboken CD-22. Unlike the massive, lumbering destroyers Dealey had faced before, a Kaiboken was a dedicated subchaser. It was small, incredibly nimble, and designed with a shallow draft specifically to hunt submarines in coastal waters. It was the absolute worst type of vessel to engage in a head-on torpedo duel. At 6:32, Patrol Boat 102 abruptly altered course, peeling away toward the safety of the bay. This maneuver left the agile CD-22 entirely alone, heading on a direct interception course with the two American submarines. Lieutenant Commander Frank Haler, the captain of the USS Hawk, evaluated the tactical geometry and realized the severe disadvantage. The water was shallow. The enemy was highly maneuverable and completely alerted. Haler made the textbook decision. He ordered the Hake to crash dive, taking his boat deep to evade the incoming subchaser. As the Hake slipped beneath the waves, Haler took one final look through his attack periscope. He expected to see the Harder diving right alongside him. Instead, what he saw sent a chill down his spine. The periscope shears of the USS Harder were still slicing through the surface water. Samuel Dealey had not ordered a dive. Once again, driven by a shattered nervous system and an addictive reliance on fatal gambles, Dealey was turning his boat's bow directly toward the charging enemy. He was setting up for another down-the-throat shot. But the CD-22 was not a sluggish transport, nor was it a heavy destroyer struggling to alter its momentum. As the Harder closed the distance and fired 3 torpedoes from her forward tubes, the captain of the Japanese subchaser saw the wakes. With a hard over of the rudder, the small, agile vessel danced out of the way. All 3 heavy torpedoes sailed harmlessly past its hull. Dealey's luck had finally run out. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he had missed his only thrust. The CD-22 immediately pounced. The subchaser accelerated directly over the Harder's position. The Japanese crew systematically rolled a devastating pattern of heavy depth charges off their stern racks. Aboard the Hake, submerged miles away, the crew listened in horror as the ocean erupted. 15 distinct catastrophic detonations hammered against their hull like the strikes of a sledgehammer. The sheer concussive force indicated that the depth charges had found their mark with pinpoint accuracy. When the Hake finally surfaced hours later, the sea was empty. There was no debris. There was no oil slick. There was only the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Commander Haler transmitted repeated radio calls on all encrypted frequencies. No response ever came. For weeks, the High Command held on to a desperate hope. But as the silence stretched into the autumn of 1944, the USS Harder was officially declared overdue and presumed lost with all hands. The resting place of this legendary submarine remained a total mystery for 8 decades. It was not until the year 2024 that the deep sea exploration team of the Lost 52 project finally located the wreck. The USS Harder lies in the crushing darkness at a depth of nearly 3,000 feet. High-resolution sonar scans revealed a haunting truth. The submarine sits upright on her keel, looking almost entirely intact, as if ready to resume her patrol. But just behind the conning tower, there is a single catastrophic hole punched straight through the pressure hull. A fatal wound delivered by a Japanese depth charge that instantly flooded the control room, dragging 80 men to the bottom before they even had time to realize they were dying. The official records of the United States Navy honor Samuel Dealey with the posthumous award of the Medal of Honor. the supreme recognition for his unprecedented wartime achievements. But the internal debriefings of the Pacific Fleet harbor a much darker narrative. The USS Harder and her entire crew should never have been ordered to undertake that sixth patrol. According to standard wartime medical protocols, after 5 consecutive combat patrols besieged by hundreds of depth charges, every submarine commander was required to be rotated ashore. The archives still retain the original report from Dealey's executive officer, clearly documenting that the captain had descended into a state of psychological shock, his reflexes sluggish, completely disregarding minimum safety protocols. But the command structure capitulated. They yielded to the combat hunger of a single individual, and they yielded to the radiant halo surrounding the title of Destroyer Killer. When Dealey made the decision to remain at periscope depth and stubbornly point his torpedo tubes directly at a Japanese anti-submarine vessel off the coast of Palawan, instead of diving deep to evade, it was not a stroke of tactical genius. It was, in all likelihood, the final symptom of a nervous system that had been stretched until it snapped. 18 months of living in the dark, subjected to the crushing pressure of the ocean floor, had entirely eroded his basic instinct for survival. No marble monuments have been erected at those coordinates in the South China Sea. 80 men of flesh and blood paid the ultimate price for the exhaustion of a command system that refused to see the human breaking point. They rest quietly with their boat in the abyss, leaving behind a monumental legacy and a bitter lesson about the absolute limits of human endurance in the theater of war.